Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in Missouri Ozarks history. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and what times of day or night these documented stories reach. In the autumn of 1898, the small settlement of Thornhill in the western edge of the Missouri Ozarks became the focal point of what locals still refer to as the darkness. What began as a simple discovery near an abandoned homestead would eventually expose a decades-long pattern of disappearances that local authorities were either unwilling or unable to investigate. The story of what came to be known as the bottom of the world remains one of the most disturbing documented cases in the region's history, though many have tried to erase it from official records. The Thornhill settlement sat nestled between rolling hills and dense woodland, approximately 12 miles south of what is now Springfield. It was a community built on timber and limited mining operations, with fewer than 300 residents spread across a 20-mile radius. Most families lived in relative isolation, connected by dirt roads that became nearly impassable during heavy rains. The nearest telegraph office was in Springfield, and news traveled slowly, if at all. The settlement had been established in the 1830s by migrants from Tennessee and Kentucky, drawn by the promise of cheap land and abundant resources. By 1898, Thornhill had developed into a close-knit community where most residents could trace their lineage back to the original settlers. This insularity fostered a culture of silence around certain local matters, particularly those concerning the old properties in the eastern hills. On September 15, 1898, a land surveyor named Thomas Garfield was charting property boundaries for a potential railway extension when he noticed something peculiar about an old well on the former Ellis property. The Ellis homestead had been abandoned for nearly 15 years, following the mysterious departure of its owners, but the well remained, partially covered by a weathered wooden platform that had begun to rot and collapse inward. According to Garfield's field notes, preserved in the Missouri Historical Society archives until 1961, when they were transferred to microfilm and subsequently misplaced during a facility renovation, the well appeared uncommonly deep with no discernible bottom visible even in broad daylight. What caught Garfield's attention, however, was not the depth itself, but the odd acoustics surrounding it. In his journal he wrote, "When standing near the opening, all ambient sound seems to diminish as if drawn downward. The songs of birds, the rustling of leaves, all become muted in proximity to this peculiar pit." Curiosity piqued, Garfield dropped a small stone into the well, expecting to hear it strike water. He reported waiting for no less than 20 seconds without hearing any impact. Assuming the stone had perhaps lodged itself against the wall of the well during its descent, he tried again with a larger rock. Again, no sound of impact reached his ears. Garfield, a man of science and practical experience, who had surveyed dozens of properties throughout the Midwest, found himself increasingly disturbed by the well's seemingly impossible depth. He noted in his journal that the construction appeared professional but unusual. The stone lining the upper portion was fitted with remarkable precision, using techniques more common to formal masonry than typical rural well construction. That evening, Garfield mentioned his finding to the owner of the boarding house where he was staying, a widow named Abigail Morton. Her reaction, as recorded in his journal, was immediate and severe. Mrs. Morton's countenance transformed entirely. She insisted I not return to that location, referring to it as the bottom of the world, a term I would later discover was common among longtime residents. According to Garfield's notes, Mrs. Morton refused to elaborate further that evening, changing the subject whenever he attempted to inquire about the well or the Ellis family. However, he observed that she placed a small iron token, something resembling a horseshoe nail bent into a circle, outside his bedroom door that night. When questioned about it the following morning, she claimed it was just an old custom and again refused to discuss the matter. The following day, despite Mrs. Morton's warning, Garfield returned to the Ellis property with rudimentary measuring equipment. a length of rope weighted with a heavy iron tool. According to his notes, he lowered the rope for more than 150 feet before running out of line without the weight touching bottom or water. This struck him as impossible given the known geology of the region, where the water table typically sat at depths of 40 to 60 feet. More troubling were Garfield's observations about the surrounding area. In a 20-foot radius around the well, the ground appeared unusually barren. No weeds grew, no insects moved across the soil, and even the air felt different, heavier, as though reluctant to enter one's lungs, as he described it. The surveyor made a small mark in the well's stone lining at ground level, intending to check if the ground itself was gradually sinking around the opening. This detail would later prove significant. Garfield's professional curiosity soon gave way to an uncharacteristic unease. In his final journal entry regarding the well, dated September 17th, he wrote, "There is something decidedly wrong about this formation. Natural explanations fail to satisfy. The darkness within seems to possess a quality beyond mere absence of light, something palpable and aware. I find myself reluctant to turn my back to it." The surveyor departed the region 3 days later, leaving his assignment unfinished, a decision that would have been entirely out of character for a man. Described by colleagues as methodical to the point of obsession, his subsequent correspondence with the railway company cited only unsuitable terrain conditions as his reason for abandoning the project. What Garfield did not include in his official report, but confided to a colleague in a personal letter discovered in 1943, was that during his final examination of the well, he distinctly heard what sounded like distant voices emanating from its depths. The voices, he wrote, seemed to be engaged in conversation, though no words could be discerned. Most disturbing was his certainty that one of the voices had called his name just as he was preparing to leave. "Not in greeting," he wrote, "but in recognition, as though my presence had been noted and recorded." The story might have ended there, an odd geological anomaly encountered by a superstitious surveyor, had it not been for what happened 6 weeks later when a local farmer named Jeremiah Watts disappeared while searching for stray cattle near the abandoned Ellis property. Watts was last seen on the morning of November 2, 1898. His wife reported that he had set out before dawn to locate 3 missing cows that had broken through a fence during the night. When he failed to return by evening, a search party was organized from neighboring farms. They found his rifle leaning against a tree approximately 50 yards from the Ellis well, along with a small tin of tobacco and a half-eaten biscuit, suggesting he had stopped for a brief rest. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, no indications of animal attack or robbery. Jeremiah Watts had simply vanished. The search continued for 2 weeks before being officially abandoned. During this time, several searchers reported strange experiences in the vicinity of the Ellis well. One man, William Carson, claimed that while calling Watts's name near the well, he heard what sounded like a distant echo of his own voice returning from the depths, but the words were somehow altered, as though someone below were responding with different phrases entirely. Carson's account was dismissed by most as the product of exhaustion and grief for his missing friend. Yet 3 other men independently described a similar phenomenon, voices that seemed to emanate from the well, but were just beyond the threshold of comprehensibility. Most disturbing was the testimony of Joseph Harmon, Watts's brother-in-law, who spent several nights camped near the well during the search. According to statements made to Sheriff Pemberton and recorded in his personal journal, though notably absent from official reports, Harmon claimed that on the 3rd night he heard Watts' voice clearly calling from the well. The voice repeatedly asked for help, saying he was lost in the dark. Harmon described lowering a lantern on a rope, only to have it extinguished at a depth of approximately 30 feet. When he pulled the lantern back up, it was intact, but filled with a fine black powder that resembled coal dust, but left no stain when touched. Harmon's account was corroborated by 2 other searchers who had joined him that night. All 3 men refused to return to the site afterward, with one reportedly suffering from tremors and insomnia for months following the incident. The county sheriff, Elias Pemberton, visited the site on November 18th. His official report, filed in Springfield and later referenced in a 1937 compilation of regional historical records, contains a curiously detached description. The well on the former Ellis property appears to be an ordinary structure, though deeper than is common. No evidence connects this location to the disappearance of J. Watts. Local tales regarding unusual properties of said well are attributed to folk superstition and will not be pursued further. What Sheriff Pemberton's report failed to mention, but was later revealed through his personal correspondence discovered during his estate settlement in 1915, was that he had explicitly forbidden his deputies from investigating the well further or even mentioning it in connection with Watts's disappearance. In a letter to his brother living in St. Louis, dated November 20, 1898, Pemberton wrote, "Some places in these hills harbor old darkness. The Ellis Well is one such place. The families who've lived in Thornhill for generations know to avoid it. Those who don't heed such wisdom often aren't given a second chance to learn." The letter suggests Pemberton was aware of previous incidents connected to the well, though no official records of such events have ever been found. This absence itself became significant to later researchers, suggesting a pattern of deliberate omission from local records. Another telling detail emerged from Pemberton's personal diary, in which he noted that during his inspection of the well, he had observed Garfield's marking on the stone lining, the mark that had been at ground level just 2 months earlier. According to Pemberton's measurements, that mark now sat 4 inches above the surrounding soil, suggesting either that the well structure was somehow rising or, more disturbing, that the ground around it was gradually sinking. Winter arrived early that year, with heavy snowfall making the Ellis property inaccessible until spring. By then, the disappearance of Jeremiah Watts had been reluctantly accepted by the community. His wife and 2 adult sons eventually relocated to Kansas, selling their property to a neighboring farmer at a considerably reduced price. A detail recorded in the county clerk's property transfer documents, but rarely mentioned in subsequent accounts. The sale agreement included a specific clause prohibiting the new owner from digging any new wells on the property, with the unusual stipulation that this restriction would transfer to all future owners in perpetuity. For nearly a decade, the Ellis well faded from local attention. The property remained unclaimed, the taxes unpaid, the land reverting to county ownership but never auctioned. According to county records, 3 different land assessors assigned to evaluate the property between 1899 and 1907 failed to complete their assignments. One submitted a report citing unsuitable access conditions, while the other 2 simply never filed reports at all. Local rumors suggested that one of the assessors, a man named Franklin Pierce, who had recently moved to the area from Illinois, had actually disappeared during his survey of the property. However, county employment records indicate that Pierce had formally resigned his position and relocated to Kansas City, though no subsequent trace of him has ever been found in that location's records. In the spring of 1908, the well regained prominence in local discourse following an unusual meteorological event. On April 3rd, witnesses throughout the region reported a peculiar fog that seemed to originate from the direction of the Ellis property. Unlike typical morning mist, this fog was described as unusually dense and dark, with several accounts noting that it seemed to move against the prevailing wind. Martha Jenkins, who operated the general store in Thornhill, recorded in her personal diary, "The fog came like something alive, seeping around doors even when closed tight. The air grew cold in a way that felt unnatural for April. Several customers remarked that the fog carried an odor, not like dampness or earth, but something metallic and foreign. By nightfall it had dissipated, but many complained of headaches and unease that lingered for days after." Jenkins further noted that during the fog, her store's mirror, a prized possession imported from St. Louis, developed a strange defect. The reflective surface appeared to ripple when viewed from certain angles, and several customers reported seeing movements in the mirror that didn't correspond to anything in the room. Jenkins eventually covered the mirror with a cloth and later that month had it removed and destroyed. 3 elderly residents of the area died in the week following the fog's appearance. While the deaths were attributed to natural causes given the advanced age of the deceased, local physician Dr. Samuel Hawkins noted in his records that all 3 exhibited unusual symptoms before their passing. His medical notes, discovered during a courthouse archive reorganization in 1952, described pronounced discoloration around the eyes and fingernails, and a peculiar rigidity of the facial muscles producing an expression of extreme distress. Dr. Hawkins also documented that all 3 deceased had reported the same dream in the nights before their deaths, a dream of standing at the edge of a deep pit while voices called to them from below. Voices they recognized as belonging to long-dead family members. It was in this atmosphere of renewed unease that Thomas Burke, a professor of geology from Washington University in St. Louis, arrived in Thornhill. Burke had heard accounts of the unusually deep well from colleagues and had corresponded briefly with Thomas Garfield years earlier. With the railway having long abandoned interest in the area, Burke's curiosity was purely academic. He sought to document and potentially explain the geological anomaly. Burke's background made him particularly well-suited to such investigation. Before joining the university, he had worked for mining operations in Colorado and had extensive experience with unusual subterranean formations. His published works on karst topography and limestone cave systems were considered authoritative in the field. If anyone could provide a rational explanation for the Ellis Well, it would be Burke. On April 17, 1908, Burke and 2 graduate students established a camp near the Ellis property. Their equipment included more sophisticated measuring devices than Garfield had possessed, including several hundred feet of steel cable, temperature, and barometric sensors, and a camera with flash apparatus for documenting the well's interior. Burke's meticulous field journal provides the most comprehensive description of the well as it existed at that time. The opening measures approximately 3 feet in diameter, lined with fitted stone to a depth of about 12 feet, after which it appears to have been bored through solid limestone. The stonework is exceptionally well crafted, suggesting considerable investment beyond what would be typical for a rural water source. Most peculiar is the absence of moisture or moss on the interior walls, which should be present in any well of significant age in this climate. The journal includes detailed sketches of the well's construction, noting that the stone lining contained no mortar between the blocks. They were fitted together with such precision that no binding material had been necessary. Burke observed that this technique had more in common with certain pre-Columbian construction methods than with European-derived American masonry of the 19th century. The team's first measurement attempt confirmed Garfield's experience. Their weighted cable descended to its full length of 300 feet without striking bottom. Burke noted that this depth would place the bottom of the well, if it existed at that length, well below the water table for the region, yet no water was present. Even more puzzling was his observation that the well shaft did not descend vertically for its entire length. At approximately 80 feet, the shaft appeared to curve slightly to the east before returning to a vertical orientation. This curvature, while subtle, defied conventional well drilling techniques of the period, which could not easily create deliberate bends in a shaft of that depth. On their second day of investigation, Burke conducted acoustic tests, noting that sounds produced at the surface seemed to be absorbed rather than reflected from the depths. When one of his students played a harmonica near the opening, the notes became strangely altered, as though heard underwater or through some intervening medium that changed their fundamental properties. Burke also attempted to measure air movement within the well shaft, using smoke and lightweight materials suspended on threads. He recorded a consistent upward draft from the depths, a phenomenon he initially attributed to natural thermal convection. However, the temperature differential required to produce such steady airflow would have been far greater than what their instruments detected. Most concerning was his observation that the air emerging from the well contained an unusually high concentration of carbon dioxide, along with trace amounts of gases his equipment could not identify. He noted that prolonged exposure to this air produced a state of mild euphoria followed by confusion and headache, effects he observed in himself and both students after their first full day of work. It was on the third day that the expedition experienced its first truly inexplicable phenomenon. Burke had lowered a thermometer into the well and was recording a steady decrease in temperature corresponding to the depth, an expected finding. At approximately 120 feet, however, the temperature suddenly increased by nearly 20 degrees. Assuming instrument error, Burke raised and examined the thermometer, found it functioning correctly, and lowered it again with the same result. More troubling was the discovery that their carefully measured cable now indicated different depths on successive trials. Burke wrote, "The first measurement indicated the temperature anomaly at 119 feet. The second, conducted immediately after, showed it at 137 feet. A third attempt placed it at 106 feet. These discrepancies cannot be attributed to measurement error, as we have taken extreme care with our markings." Burke theorized that the well shaft might somehow be in motion, expanding and contracting in a manner inconsistent with known geological processes. He noted that such movement would require enormous energy and would typically be accompanied by seismic activity, yet their instruments detected no vibrations or earth movements. That evening, Burke recorded a disturbing observation. Edwards, one of the graduate students, has been standing at the well's edge for nearly an hour, unresponsive to conversation. When finally persuaded to return to camp, he claimed to have heard voices calling his name from below. He appears rational otherwise, but insists on the reality of his experience. Preston, the second student, reports hearing nothing of the sort. Burke's journal entry continues with a clinical description of Edwards's condition. His pupils are dilated, pulse elevated. He exhibits an unusual fixation on the well, repeatedly expressing a desire to construct some means of descending into it. I have secured our climbing equipment as a precaution and have insisted he remain in the tent. Preston will take the first watch while I document these events. Later that night, Burke added, Edwards has fallen into a fitful sleep, but speaks occasionally in what sounds like Latin, mixed with some other language I cannot identify. Preston suggests it may be Greek, though neither of us is sufficiently versed in classical languages to be certain. The phrases seem to follow rhythmic patterns, suggestive of ritual recitation rather than normal speech. The following morning, Edwards was gone. His bedroll had been slept in, but his boots and jacket were missing. A search of the immediate area revealed footprints leading directly to the well, then stopping. Burke and Preston spent the day searching and calling for their colleague, eventually alerting the residents of Thornhill, who assembled another search party. No trace of Edwards was ever found. Burke's journal entries become increasingly agitated following the disappearance. Preston insists we abandon the site immediately. Local residents refuse to approach the well, even to assist in the search. Sheriff Adams suggests Edwards likely deserted our expedition and left the area of his own accord, an absurd proposition given that his personal belongings and wallet remain in our camp. Preston's condition also began to deteriorate, according to Burke's observations. He complains of dreams in which he finds himself descending an endless spiral staircase. In these dreams, he reports hearing Edwards calling from somewhere far below, along with many other voices speaking in unison. He has developed a nervous habit of drawing spiral patterns in his notebook, concentric circles that gradually close in on themselves. When I pointed this out, he seemed unaware he had been doing it. Burke himself reported increasing difficulty maintaining scientific objectivity. His handwriting, steady and precise in earlier entries, became increasingly erratic. He noted experiencing brief moments of missing time, during which he would find himself standing at the well's edge with no memory of having approached it. Most disturbing was his report of visual phenomena within the well shaft. When examining the opening with our electric lamp, I observed what appeared to be faint bluish lights at extreme depth, pinpoints that seemed to move in coordinated patterns. Preston could not see them. When I attempted to photograph the phenomenon, the camera's flash mechanism failed despite having functioned perfectly during testing. Burke's final entry, dated April 22nd, contains a troubling admission. I stood watch until dawn while Preston slept. Twice I heard what sounded like Edward's voice emerging from the well calling my name. The quality of the sound was wrong, hollow, as though reaching me from an impossible distance. More disturbing was its content. My name was clear, but the surrounding words formed sentences I could not quite grasp, yet filled me with profound unease. I find myself drawn to investigate further, despite every rational instinct counseling retreat. The journal ends there. According to Sheriff Adams' report, filed 2 days later, Burke and Preston's camp was found abandoned. Their equipment remained, including Burke's journal, but both men had vanished. The only sign of their departure was a set of footprints leading to the well, 2 pairs this time, one matching Burke's boots and another matching Preston's. A detail not included in the official report, but later revealed through Sheriff Adams' private correspondence. When examining the well following the disappearances, he discovered that the stone lining now extended 18 inches higher above ground level than when Burke had first documented it. The surrounding soil appeared to have subsided, creating a slight depression with the well at its center. Adams also reported finding a strange symbol carved into one of the stones near the top of the well, a spiral pattern identical to those Preston had been drawing in his notebook. The carving appeared fresh, but contained an unusual residue that Adams described as similar to ash, but oily to the touch. The disappearance of 3 educated men from a respected university created brief interest from authorities in Springfield. A more thorough investigation was promised, but ultimately proved superficial. Within weeks, the official conclusion stated that the men had likely abandoned their research and departed the area despite leaving behind all their belongings and equipment. More significant was the response of local residents. Within days of the disappearances, a group of men from the oldest families in Thornhill arrived at the Ellis property, with wagons loaded with large stones and cement. Working from a distance using long poles and ropes, they constructed a heavy covering over the well, sealing it beneath layers of rock, metal, and concrete. According to witnesses, not a word was spoken during this day-long effort. One participant in this sealing operation, Jacob Thornton, left a brief account in a letter to his son, who had moved to Oklahoma Territory. The letter, discovered during a family archive donation to the State Historical Society in 1947, stated, "We should have sealed it when my grandfather first discovered what lay beneath. He warned us, but we didn't listen. Now it's grown too strong. The covering we've built won't hold forever, but perhaps long enough for people to forget where it is. Never return to Thornhill, James. Promise me that." When questioned about this action, the participants would say only that it should have been done generations ago. County officials, seemingly relieved to have the site secured, raised no objections to this unauthorized construction on county-owned land. A curious footnote to these events appears in the meteorological records for the region. For nearly a month following the sealing of the well, weather patterns in the immediate vicinity of Thornhill showed significant anomalies: unusually low barometric pressure, cloud formations that appeared to circle above the Ellis property, and several instances of what witnesses described as heat lightning on clear days, always concentrated in the same area. For nearly 30 years, the sealed well remained undisturbed. The Ellis property continued to sit vacant, avoided by locals and unknown to outsiders. The story of the bottom of the world became a whispered tale told to frighten children away from wandering too far into the hills, though notably the actual location was never specified in these stories. Local physician Dr. William Hawkins, who had inherited his father's practice, maintained a curious record during these years. In a separate ledger from his regular medical notes, discovered after his death in 1942, he documented cases of what he termed the well sickness, a condition characterized by insomnia, auditory hallucinations, and a compulsion to travel eastward toward the hills. The ledger indicates that such cases spiked every 7 years, beginning in 1915, with the most recent and severe occurrence in 1936. During this last outbreak, Hawkins recorded treating 17 patients with symptoms, all of whom reported dreams of descending into darkness while voices called to them. 3 of these patients eventually disappeared, though Hawkins's notes suggest they had gone to join the voices rather than met with foul play. No official missing persons reports were ever filed. In 1938, as part of the federal government's historical documentation projects during the Depression, a folklorist named Margaret Wilson visited the Ozarks to record local legends and oral histories. Her work brought her to Thornhill, where elderly residents shared various tales of the region. Wilson's notes, archived at the University of Missouri until 1967, when they were partially damaged in a storage facility flood, contained multiple references to the Ellis Well. One account, attributed to Rebecca Gardner, then 83 years old, suggested the well predated the Ellis family's arrival in the 1860s. That opening was there before white settlers came to these hills. The Ellis family built around what was already there. The old Cherokee who were forced out knew about it. They would leave offerings near it, never food or valuable things like you might expect, but broken items, things that were damaged, like they were returning them to where they came from. Gardner further claimed that her grandfather, who had been among the first settlers in the region, had discovered the opening while clearing land in 1838. He described it as a perfect circle in the limestone, descending into darkness. His initial attempt to use it as a well failed when no water was reached despite extensive digging. According to family lore, he eventually covered the opening with heavy stones after several of his livestock disappeared in its vicinity. Another resident, James Thornton, provided a different perspective. My grandfather helped dig that well in 1848. He said they hit something strange about 50 feet down, not water or rock, but a void that seemed to continue endlessly. They were prepared to abandon the project, but Martin Ellis insisted they continue. Ellis would sometimes spend hours just staring down into that darkness. After his wife died in 52, he became obsessed with it. Some said he believed he could hear her voice coming from below. Thornton also recounted a disturbing incident from his childhood in the 1870s. I was about 10 years old when Pa took me to the Ellis place on some business. While the men talked, I wandered toward that well. There was a wooden platform over it then, but with cracks between the boards. I lay down and put my eye to one of those cracks, thinking I might see water below. Instead, I saw only darkness, but a darkness that seemed to move, to shift like something alive. And there was a smell coming up, not like earth or water, but like something burning far away, he continued. As I was looking, I heard a sound coming up from below. A sound like many people whispering all at once, too quiet to make out the words. Then they got louder, and I could have sworn I heard my name. That's when Mr. Ellis came running over, yanking me away from that opening like I'd been about to fall in. The look on his face, I'll never forget it. Not angry, but terrified. He told my father to take me home immediately and never bring me back. The discrepancies between these accounts might normally be attributed to the natural distortion of oral history. But Wilson noted a curious consistency among all the tales. None of the storytellers would speak about the well after sundown, and all made the same gesture, a circular motion followed by a downward sweep of the hand when referring to it. Wilson became increasingly interested in the well, particularly after discovering no official record of the Ellis family's departure from the area in the 1880s. County documents showed property tax payments abruptly ceasing in 1883, but no sale or transfer of the land was ever recorded. In her personal diary, Wilson noted, "The reluctance of residents to discuss the Ellis family's fate is striking. When pressed, they offer only vague references to a family tragedy or suggest the Ellis household relocated to California. However, no corroborating documentation exists for either explanation. Most telling is the way conversations about the family invariably lead to discussions of the well. though locals seem unaware of making this connection. According to her field notes, Wilson attempted to locate the sealed well in June 1938. Several residents gave her deliberately misleading directions, sending her to various abandoned properties scattered throughout the hills. When she persisted, she was finally told bluntly by the town's elderly physician, Dr. William Hawkins, son of the previously mentioned Dr. Samuel Hawkins. "Some things are buried for good reasons, Miss Wilson. Some histories shouldn't be unearthed." Undeterred, Wilson eventually found a guide in John Bedford, a man in his 70s who claimed his brother had been among those who sealed the well in 1908. Bedford agreed to show her the location, but refused to approach it closely. From a distance of about 50 yards, he pointed out an unnatural mound of stones partially overgrown with vegetation. Bedford shared a disturbing detail not recorded in any official documentation. After they sealed it, they posted a watch for 3 days and nights. On the third night, the concrete cracked clean across, and a sound came up from below, like a long, slow exhale. That crack is still there, though you can't see it from here. Every few years, it gets a little wider. Wilson's notes describe what happened next. Mr. Bedford remained by the road while I approached the mound. The concrete cap was still intact, but showed significant cracking. Around its perimeter, the soil appeared unusually dark and strangely barren. No weeds or moss grew within several feet of the structure. As I circled it, taking photographs, I became aware of an unusual silence. The woods, which had been filled with birdsong moments earlier, had gone completely quiet, she continued. The concrete seal measures approximately 8 feet in diameter and rises about 2 feet above the surrounding ground, which dips noticeably toward it, creating a shallow, bowl-like depression. The surface bears evidence of multiple repair attempts, patches of newer cement over what appears to be a pattern of radiating cracks, all stemming from a central point. The most disturbing entry in Wilson's journal, dated June 12, 1938, recounts, "While examining the sealed opening, I distinctly felt vibrations beneath my feet, as though something far below were in motion. Placing my ear against the concrete, against Mr. Bedford's vehement objections from afar, I detected what might have been the sound of rushing air or distant water. But beneath that was something else, a rhythmic pattern that bore unsettling resemblance to human speech. Though no distinct words could be discerned, Wilson departed the region shortly thereafter, her research apparently complete. Her official report submitted to the Federal Writers' Project contains no mention of the Ellis Well or the strange phenomena she had documented in her personal notes. Instead, it focuses on harmless local color, quilting patterns, folk remedies, and holiday traditions. However, Wilson's correspondence with a colleague at Columbia University, discovered during a 1960 archival review, reveals her continued preoccupation with what she had encountered. In a letter dated September 1938, she wrote, "I cannot shake the impression that something ancient and malevolent resides beneath that sealed opening. The consistent avoidance patterns displayed by generations of local residents spanning different cultural backgrounds suggests a recognized danger that transcends mere superstition. I find myself returning to the account of Thomas Burke and his students, wondering what they might have heard or seen in those final hours." She continued, "Most troubling is the pattern I've discerned in the historical record, not what is present, but what is absent. Official documents pertaining to the well and the Ellis family show clear evidence of selective removal. When one compares county records from before 1883 to those after, entire sections have been excised, sometimes crudely. This suggests a deliberate effort to expunge certain events from the historical record, an effort that appears to have continued for decades." Wilson never returned to the Ozarks. Her subsequent work focused on New England folk traditions, with no further mention of her experiences in Missouri. When she died in 1954, her personal papers were donated to the university archives, where they remained largely unexamined until historian Robert Chambers discovered them during research for a book on Depression-era folklore studies. A curious footnote to Wilson's research appeared in 1957, when a Springfield newspaper published a brief article about an elderly woman found wandering in the woods near the former Thornhill settlement. The woman, who identified herself as Margaret Wilson, though no connection to the folklorist was established, claimed to have been lost in the dark for a very long time. She was unable to account for her whereabouts or activities and exhibited signs of exposure and malnutrition despite being found during warm weather. The article noted that she was taken to a state facility for evaluation, with no further updates published. Chambers became particularly interested in the Ellis well after finding Wilson's photographs of the sealed opening. In one image, barely noticeable until enhanced, a thin dark vapor appears to be emerging from a crack in the concrete. Chambers would later write, "What struck me was not just the vapor itself, which could be attributed to temperature differences or natural gas emissions, but the unnatural way it seemed to coalesce just above the surface, maintaining a distinct shape that resembles a reaching hand." Further analysis of Wilson's photographs revealed another anomaly not mentioned in her notes. When viewed in sequence, the images show subtle changes in the concrete seal's position relative to fixed points in the background. Chambers calculated that over the course of approximately 40 minutes, based on the timestamps Wilson had meticulously recorded, the entire structure had shifted about 3 inches to the west, a movement that would have required significant force and should have produced noticeable noise or vibration, yet Wilson reported experiencing neither. In 1962, Chambers traveled to the Ozarks, intending to locate the well site and possibly document any changes since Wilson's visit 24 years earlier. The landscape, however, had been dramatically altered. The post-war expansion of nearby Springfield had extended development into previously rural areas. New roads cut through the hills, and much of the forest had been cleared for housing. After several days of searching and consulting with local officials, Chambers determined that the Ellis property had been purchased by a development company in 1957. The area had been bulldozed for a planned subdivision, though construction had mysteriously stalled after initial ground clearing. Chambers located Harold Winters, a heavy equipment operator who had worked on the site preparation. Winters recalled, "We were told to level that whole section, clear the trees, remove any old structures. There was this big concrete cap we came across. Nobody knew what it was, maybe an old cistern or something. The foreman told us to break it up and fill in whatever was underneath." According to Winters, the demolition of the concrete cap revealed an opening that seemed to go down forever. Workers lowered a lantern on a rope but could not see a bottom. More concerning was the effect the open well seemed to have on the work crew. "Nobody wanted to get near it," Winters told Chambers. "Made you feel wrong somehow, dizzy, disoriented." 2 men quit that same day. The rest of us refused to work within 50 feet of it. The foreman finally decided to fill it in. We dumped truckloads of rock and dirt down that hole for hours. It never seemed to fill up. By the end of the day, we just pushed soil over the top to cover the opening and moved on to another section. Winters recalled another troubling detail. One of our guys, Dave Mercer, got real strange after looking down that hole too long, started talking about voices calling him. That night at the motel, he kept saying he needed to go back, that they were waiting for him. Next morning he was gone, left all his things behind. The police report said he probably just quit and moved on, but none of us believed that. The development project was abandoned weeks later, officially due to unstable ground conditions unsuitable for residential construction. The land remained vacant until 1960, when it was purchased by the county for a planned water reservoir. That project, too, was eventually abandoned after engineers reported anomalous geological features that would make water retention impossible. The engineering report, which Chambers obtained through a former colleague at the State University, contained a curious technical anomaly. Soil density tests conducted across the site showed normal results except for one circular area approximately 60 feet in diameter, where the equipment registered readings consistent with a void or extremely low-density material extending to an indeterminate depth. The report recommended extensive core sampling before any construction, but the county opted to simply abandon the project instead. Chambers spent several days searching the altered landscape, trying to match Wilson's photographs with the current topography. He eventually identified what he believed to be the location, now nothing more than a slight depression in an overgrown field, with no visible evidence of the well's existence. In his field journal, Chambers noted, "The site feels wrong. Standing here, I experience a sensation of being watched from below. The air seems heavier, resistant. Most notable is the complete absence of wildlife. No birds, no insects, not even signs of deer or small mammals that are abundant just 100 yards away," he continued. The ground at the center of the depression exhibits a subtle but distinct motion, perceptible only when observed over time. By placing a straight edge across the diameter and marking its position, I have confirmed a rhythmic rise and fall of approximately 3 millimeters, with a periodicity of roughly 20 minutes, reminiscent of breathing. Curious about the long history of abandonment, Chambers delved into county records, discovering a pattern he found deeply troubling. Since 1848, 8 different owners had laid claim to the property containing the well. Each had abandoned it within 2 to 5 years, often leaving no record of where they had gone. The Ellis family had remained the longest, nearly 20 years, before their unexplained departure. More disturbing was Chambers' discovery that Thomas Burke had not been the first academic to investigate the well. In a dusty file in the County Historical Society, he found reference to an 1876 visit by a geologist from St. Louis named Harrison Miller. Miller had apparently spent just 1 day at the site before departing abruptly, leaving his equipment behind. A brief note to his university, sent from Springfield, stated only, "Returning immediately." The Ellis Formation is not a natural phenomenon. Further investigation inadvisable. No additional records of Miller could be found, and his formal report, if ever completed, had not been preserved. However, Chambers discovered a personal letter Miller had sent to a colleague, preserved in the archives of the Missouri Geological Survey. In it, Miller described lowering a specialized thermometer into the well and obtaining readings that defy all known principles of geothermal gradient. More concerning was his description of what happened when he attempted to collect an air sample from deep within the shaft. The collection vessel, upon retrieval, contained not air, but a black particulate that moved of its own accord within the glass container. I have sealed this specimen and will bring it directly to your laboratory. No record of this specimen or any analysis of it exists in the university archives. Miller himself seems to have disappeared from academic circles shortly after his return from the Ozarks. A brief obituary in a St. Louis newspaper from 1877 mentions only that he died after a brief illness, with no details provided. During his final day in the region, Chambers interviewed Abigail Morton's granddaughter, Eleanor Simmons, then in her 80s. She recalled stories her grandmother had told about the Ellis family. Grandmother said Martha Ellis changed after her baby died in 1880. She would sit by that well for hours, claiming she could hear her infant crying from below. Eventually, she refused to leave the well at all. They brought her food there, where she sat on a chair right at the edge, leaning forward to listen. According to Simmons, Martha Ellis began to speak of the people below who were caring for her child. She claimed they had promised to return the baby to her if she would open the way completely. Thomas Ellis reportedly became increasingly concerned about his wife's mental state and attempted to seal the well temporarily with heavy timbers. The following morning, the timbers had been removed and placed in a neat stack nearby, despite their considerable weight. Simmons continued, Grandmother said Thomas Ellis consulted with the local minister and several old men from the founding families. They performed some kind of ritual at the site, not Christian prayers, but something older that had been passed down. For a time, Martha seemed to improve. She stopped going to the well and resumed her household duties. But Thomas began to change then. He would be seen walking toward the well late at night. Some mornings his boots would be caked with a strange, black mud, unlike any soil found in the region. According to Simmons, the entire Ellis family, Thomas, Martha, and their 4 remaining children, vanished over the course of a single night in November 1883. Neighbors found the house empty, meals half-eaten on the table, lamps still burning. The only sign of disturbance was the back door, which had been forced open from the inside. The bolt and part of the frame were broken outward, as if someone had needed to get out in desperate haste. What Simmons related next particularly disturbed Chambers. Grandmother said that for weeks after the Ellis family disappeared, people reported hearing their voices coming from the well, not just Martha's, but all of them, sometimes speaking together in a way that made no sense. The voices gradually faded but never completely vanished. Decades later, people would still occasionally hear something from that darkness that sounded almost, but not quite, human. Simmons also shared a detail absent from all official records. After the Ellis family's disappearance, several men from the community entered the home to secure it. In the master bedroom, they discovered a journal kept by Thomas Ellis. The final entry, dated the night of the disappearance, contained only a crude drawing of concentric circles surrounding a central void, with a single line of text: "They are coming up." According to Simmons, the men burned the journal on the spot and agreed never to speak of its contents. They also allegedly discovered a small container of black soil on the bedside table, soil that would occasionally shift of its own accord when no one was touching it. This too was destroyed. Chambers concluded his investigation with more questions than answers. His notes reflect growing unease. "I cannot escape the conclusion that something sentient resides at the bottom of the Ellis well, something that has exerted influence over this region for generations. The consistent patterns of disappearance, the acoustic anomalies, the psychological effects on those who approach too closely all suggest an intelligence at work." During his final night in the area, Chambers did something none of his predecessors had attempted. He placed a recording device near what he believed to be the filled-in well location, connected to a long cable that allowed him to monitor from a safe distance. His journal entry from that evening describes what happened. At approximately 11:17 p.m., the recording equipment began to malfunction. The reels continued to turn, but the sound level indicators fluctuated wildly. At 11:42, I heard a distant humming through the headphones, not electrical interference, but something that seemed to originate from beneath the ground. The humming gradually resolved into what sounded like multiple voices speaking in unison, though no distinct words were discernible. At midnight precisely, the voices ceased, replaced by a rhythmic sound resembling breathing. This continued for approximately 17 minutes before giving way to a single voice that spoke with unnerving clarity. The words were in English, but arranged in a syntax I found difficult to follow, references to the descent that rises and the breathing dark. Most disturbing was its direct address: "Chambers, we see your light among the others." At this point, I terminated the recording and returned to my motel. Chambers never published his findings. According to colleagues, he had compiled substantial research for a planned book, but abandoned the project in 1963. He resigned his university position the following year and reportedly relocated to New Mexico, where he lived in relative isolation until his death in 1968. Dr. Alan Foster, a former student of Chambers who helped settle his estate, later reported finding hundreds of pages of notes on the Ellis well, along with a partially completed manuscript titled The Breathing Dark. According to Foster, the manuscript began as a scholarly examination of folklore and geology, but increasingly incorporated Chambers' personal experiences and theories, many of which stretched scientific credibility. Most concerning to Foster was a collection of small soil samples Chambers had preserved in sealed glass vials, each labeled with dates and precise coordinates from the well site. Foster reported that when examined under a microscope, the soil contained unidentifiable organic structures that appeared to be in constant motion despite their isolation and the absence of any conventional energy source. Following university protocol for unknown biological materials, the samples were incinerated. The land where the Ellis well once stood was eventually incorporated into the Mark Twain National Forest in 1965. Current forestry maps show the area as an unremarkable section of woodland with no special designations or restrictions. If any trace of the well remains, it has been reclaimed by nature and forgotten by all but a few, or nearly forgotten. In 1968, just months before his death, Robert Chambers sent a sealed package to the Missouri Historical Society with instructions that it remain unopened for 50 years. When finally examined in 2018, it contained his complete research on the Ellis Well, including Wilson's photographs, transcribed interviews, and his own detailed notes. Among the materials was a hand-drawn map showing the exact location of the well site relative to geographical features unlikely to change over time, specific rock formations, creek bends, and unusual trees. A note attached to the map read simply, "For those who need to know where not to look." The package also contained a journal of observations Chambers had made during his final weeks in Missouri. The entries describe his growing certainty that something was following him, not a person, but a presence that he sensed particularly strongly at night. He noted instances of finding black soil in his shoes each morning, despite having cleaned them thoroughly the evening before. Most disturbing were his reports of dreams in which he found himself descending an endless spiral staircase while voices called to him from below. Dreams identical to those Preston had described in Burke's journal 54 years earlier. Most disturbing was a small audio reel included with the materials. The accompanying note explained that Chambers had placed a recording device near what he believed to be the filled-in well location for 24 hours in 1962. For most of the recording, only natural forest sounds are audible, but approximately 4 hours into the tape, during what would have been the darkest hours of night, a sequence of sounds defies conventional explanation. The recording captures what seems to be multiple voices speaking simultaneously, some distant, others unnervingly close to the microphone. The words are indistinct but convey a sense of conversation or recitation. Most unsettling is the quality of the voices themselves, described by audio experts who have analyzed the tape as fundamentally wrong, the cadence, pitch, and resonance falling outside the normal parameters of human speech. Between these vocal sounds are long periods of what Chambers described as the breathing of the well, a rhythmic inhalation and exhalation that gradually increases in intensity throughout the recording. The final minutes of the tape contain only silence, broken by a single clear phrase spoken very close to the microphone. The voice bears no resemblance to Chambers and speaks words that remain the most chilling aspect of the entire Ellis Well mystery. We are still descending. The official analysis of the recording, conducted by sound engineers at Washington University in 1968, concluded that the tape showed signs of deterioration and environmental contamination that could explain the unusual audio patterns. They suggested that what listeners perceived as voices and breathing might be nothing more than wind through trees, distant animal calls, and the natural creaking of the forest at night. This explanation satisfied institutional requirements, but fails to address one critical detail noted in the technician's actual report. The recording exhibits frequency patterns that do not correspond to any known natural or man-made sound source in our reference library. Of particular concern is the final vocalization, which contains harmonics impossible to produce through conventional human speech. The package also contained a series of newspaper clippings Chambers had collected, documenting a pattern he believed was connected to the well. Between 1908 and 1962, at least 27 people had disappeared in the general vicinity of the former Ellis property. In each case, the disappearances were attributed to mundane explanations, individuals moving away without notice, possible victims of crime, or simply becoming lost in the wilderness. Yet, Chambers had meticulously mapped these incidents, revealing a clear concentration around the well site, with frequency increasing over time. His final note attached to these clippings reads, "The seal is failing. What was once contained is finding new ways to reach the surface. Those who hear the voices are merely the ones we know about." In 2019, A small team of environmental researchers conducting a soil survey in the Mark Twain National Forest reported unusual findings in a remote section that corresponds to Chambers' map coordinates for the well site. Their equipment detected what they termed a significant subsurface anomaly, a cylindrical void extending far deeper than their instruments could measure. Soil samples from the area contained elevated levels of an unidentified carbon compound along with trace minerals typically found only in deep geological strata. The team's request for additional research funding was denied, with their preliminary findings dismissed as a probable equipment malfunction. Their report was filed without further action, though one team member later reported experiencing recurring dreams of descending stairs and hearing distant voices calling his name. He requested reassignment to a different project area, citing personal reasons. Today, the location once known as the bottom of the world has been lost to time and development. The Thornhill settlement exists only in historical records, absorbed by the expansion of larger communities. Few living people remember the stories of the Ellis Well, and fewer still would be able to locate where it once stood. But something remains. Forestry workers occasionally report unusual dead zones in the Mark Twain National Forest, circular areas where vegetation refuses to grow and wildlife will not enter. Hikers sometimes speak of spots where sound seems to vanish, where voices don't carry, and where an inexplicable sense of vertical vertigo can overwhelm even the most experienced outdoorsman. And there are whispers of something worse, accounts from people who have spent nights in certain remote sections of the forest, who claim to have heard voices emerging from the ground beneath their tents. Voices that sound almost, but not quite, human. Voices that seem to know their names. Local residents who still maintain connections to the old families of the region observe a curious tradition. When hiking in the eastern hills, they carry small tokens made of bent iron, circlets, similar to the one Abigail Morton placed outside Thomas Garfield's door in 1898. They avoid camping in low-lying areas where the ground feels too soft, and they never, under any circumstances, dig deeper than necessary for their campfires. Most telling is the advice given by old-timers to newcomers exploring the region. If you hear something calling from below, don't answer. If you feel the ground breathing beneath your feet, move elsewhere. And if you ever find a place where the world seems to drop away into darkness, mark it well, not to find it again, but to ensure you never return. The Missouri Ozarks hold many secrets beneath their ancient hills. Most have been forgotten, some deliberately buried, others sealed away by those who understood the dangers they posed. But as Thomas Burke discovered in his final days of investigation, some depths cannot truly be closed once they have been opened. The darkness that waits at the bottom of the world has patience that exceeds human comprehension. It measures time not in years or lifetimes, but in the slow wearing away of stone and concrete. It calls, it waits. And occasionally, when the conditions are right, when someone wanders too close to a place they should not be, it reaches up to reclaim what it considers its own. A final note found among Chambers' papers, apparently written just days before he sent his research to be sealed away, offers perhaps the most disturbing perspective on the Ellis Well phenomenon. What we perceive as a well, a downward shaft into darkness, may be something else entirely when viewed from the other side. What if it is not a descent but a passage? Not a well, but a door, and what if that door, for so long kept closed by those who understood its danger, is slowly but inexorably opening once again? The questions Chambers posed remain unanswered. The Ellis Well, if it still exists in any form, continues to keep its secrets. But occasionally, in the deepest parts of the Mark Twain National Forest, hikers report a peculiar sensation, a moment when the ground beneath their feet seems to shift slightly, as though taking a breath. And in that moment, if they listen very carefully, they might hear something rising from far below, a sound like distant voices calling names they shouldn't know, inviting them to descend into a darkness that has been waiting for a very long time.